We're talking to Stephen Yates, and this thing that was just announced this afternoon, the diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics. I mean, I don't know why we wouldn't have a full on boycott of this, and why we wouldn't have American corporations do the same. Why we are even sending our athletes over there? Because I honestly would not feel safe as an athlete going over there, especially when they disappeared one tennis star already, Steve.
Commentator has advocated for several moons that we should boycott altogether. And I've noticed that former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has started to call for the same thing. There are some athletes and prominent public figures that are beginning to say things. I haven't heard anything beyond the Women's Tennis Association. I'd like to hear whether the Men's Tennis Association stands with the Women's Tennis Association. Perhaps people can send some friendly worded emails in their direction to ask inquiring questions. But for now, we're stuck in this weird situation where a couple of months before the Olympics, the International Olympic Committee, known a little bit for some corruption in the past, is going to host an Olympics in a thoroughly corrupt capital in a country that is engaging in genocide, possibly the worst environmental criminal there is on the planet. And what are they going to celebrate? But the spirit of the games? I don't get it.
Yeah, no, it doesn't make any sense. Why? Yeah, what exactly? Because it seems like it's just a pass for China, like, oh, well, we're going to have a little diplomatic boycott, but still, by and large, we're still going to come together and go through the whole thing. Now, and we're talking with Stephen Yates, foreign policy expert. There are people out there who say, oh, well, even during the, 1936 Olympics, the United States participated and Adolf Hitler was there, and Jesse Owens he ended up not only being snubbed by Hitler, but apparently by our own president, FDR, at the time. There's an amazing backstory to that. But what do you say to people if they bring that up and say, well, we even win in the 30s with when Hitler was running Germany, so this isn't any different? Because I still feel like that's not a good enough justification. But I wanted to get your take.
Well, even if I took that argument mostly at face value, which I don't, and I try to address that in the commentary that I put out on the Daily Caller in April, if anyone wants to Google that. But basically, there is no modern day Jesse Owens right now. Our athletes don't go over there with freedom of speech. They don't have their future open and wide and free to their own decisions. If an athlete goes to the Olympics, gets gold, and puts on a protest in Beijing, what chance do they have in getting drafted into the NBA, representing a major clothing brand, going in and doing movies with Hollywood? I mean, basically, they have a guaranteed straight line to cancellation. And so there is no way to do the Jesse Owens movement in 2022 the way it happened in 1936. If it could, then I might have actually be open to go and put a very diplomatic middle finger to Winnie the Pooh, Xi Jinping, when we take gold, and just basically tell them to stuff it.
Yeah, no, and I like your take on that. By the way, I tweeted that out. Folks can look on Twitter and you can see Yates's piece about the Olympics from the Daily Caller back in April. Because you got into the 80s, you got into all of that as well. Because we had Germany, Communist China in '08, and there was only one time in 1980 that you'd said that we had actually refused to participate in the Olympics. And because it seems like, well, what I don't understand the point, and that brings a lot of money in. I mean, you're talking about sending a lot of American dollars to communist China, and so it's not a boycott until I think all these corporations would get into it, and they're not going to get involved in any. They're not going to say anything because the dollars are too. It's too much of a temptation for all these corporations in China. I mean, they're allowing just enough capitalism. They're still a communist nation to try to be competitive and try to take out and beat other countries that way, because that's ultimately what this comes down to. It's the money, like for Hollywood, the theater screens that they have over there, the people that watch the sports. I mean, when you control everything that everybody does in the government, you can direct money. I mean, it's very easy to use that to entice people.
But there's two big tools that they use to basically compel people to engage in controlled behavior and controlled speech. One is supply chain, but then the other is access to employment and further advancement. If we had secure supply chains, if we didn't have overdependence on slave labor camps in China's far west, then we would have more options and there would be no excuse. If we had corporations that were more sensitive to American consumers who were informed by their own ideals, then they would have to worry about that money. And the fact of the matter is, even though China's an enormous population, the American population buys many, many times more in consumer goods. And if American consumers would organize themselves and flex a little muscle, these companies would feel a heck of a lot more than any kind of a pressure campaign from the Chinese government. And so I would like to believe we're heading to a point of rebalancing and maybe rethinking. We've got a long way to go. But I think American consumers and a lot of people around the world that are fed up with the CCP model of bullying, stealing, dehumanizing people, taking your data and trying to control your future, maybe if you're fed up with that, start finding ways to consume in ways that don't enhance the monster.
I want to switch gears and talk about Russia and NATO here really quickly, because we're having a Pentagon press briefing right now where the United States government's been saying that apparently Russia is preparing for an invasion of Ukraine, and there's expected to be a phone call between Biden and Putin in which he's expected to demand Putin is expected to demand from Biden that there's not going to be any kind of eastward expansion of NATO. Do you think, number one, that Russia is actually are they going to invade Ukraine? Are we on the eve of that? And number two, what about NATO's alliance? Because it was a stance that they said that they would be affirmed as a member at some point. Talk to us a little bit about apparently what this means concerning U.S. involvement.
Well, Ukraine is not a member, and so there isn't kind of an automatic trigger within the treaty that says that the United States is automatically involved. And we would know that somewhat from the last time that the Obama-Biden foreign policy team was responsible for weakness that resulted in loss of sovereign territory in the Ukraine. And so there's every reason to believe that Putin and his military see somewhat of a time of opportunity with really low likelihood of consequences from this administration or from Europe. And so they could take more territory. The kind of full-on invasion where people might envision actually taking over the whole country, I think that's a really low probability. It could happen. Anything could happen. But I think that the idea of them further encroaching, bullying, holding the economy hostage for concessions, all of that's what's in play right now. This is a demonstration of force by Russia and an exposure of weakness by the United States and NATO.
Yep, it's weird to me. We're talking to Stephen Yates, foreign policy expert. It's weird to me, and you can find him, by the way, at YatesComs on Twitter. If the administration is telegraphing that, they're going to invade, that Russia's, having a buildup, etc. And then all they're doing is going out and having a press conference about it. I mean, they've never really taken a strong stance except to say, don't do that. Nuh-uh. And Russia's apparently has already told NATO if anybody decides to do anything, we will react. So, really, what can the United States say? John Kirby's talking about this right now. They're saying, the Russian aggression has to stop. But that's it. That's all that they've said. I don't think that they've done anything else new sanction-wise since Trump.
Yeah, well, foreign powers don't really much care what a spokesman says if they've talked straight to the horse, which in this case would be the president. The president and Putin have already spoken directly. At that time, President Biden told Putin that he needed to back off on cyber operations, and that was followed shortly thereafter by further cyber attacks. And so I don't know that there's anything that can be said at this point that changes anything. In fact, the only time that the words of an American president or a spokesperson have any influence over tyrants is when it happens to coincide with the movement of real material force that could do harm. And so, immediately after 9/11, when the Russians were engaged in military exercises and the United States was going up the DEFCON scale, phone calls were made. They're in full alert and there's an immediate response when they see that kind of stuff. When it's just a spokesman exercising the freedom of speech from the podium, it's not even a feather's glance against the face of the Russians at that point.
Yeah, goodness. It's such a mess, our foreign policy now. Stephen Yates keeps him busy at Yates Comms. Always good to talk with you, my friend. Thank you so much for joining us and appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.